John, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to get you back on after you were kind enough to give up an hour of your time to join us for the mastermind on eccentric training a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, thank you for having me back, Rob. This is an honor.
It's a pleasure to have you. Anyone that doesn't know who you are, we didn't do intros in the mastermind because we've got a set time of an hour, so I bin them off and said they're a waste of time. But I think in the podcast, it's quite nice to have a little bit of an intro to the guest, even if it's just a couple of minutes, so people get a bit of an insight into the background and whatnot. So if you wouldn't mind doing the honors, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I guess I'll kind of start at where I'm at now and work backwards a little bit. I currently work for the Kansas City Royals in Major League Baseball. I'm our Director of Performance Science, Player Development. I work with a lot of really great people here, and it's a wonderful organization. Prior to being with the Royals, I did my PhD at East Tennessee State. Worked under Dr. Mike Stone within kind of the lab side of my PhD, and then on the practical coaching side, got the opportunity to work under Dr. Brad DeWeese. Before that, I was mostly in the men's basketball world on the S&C side. Worked at DePaul University for a number of years, and then actually prior to getting into S&C, I was a baseball coach for a couple of years and played in college, and so it's kind of lended itself well now that I've transitioned into baseball on the sports science S&C side, because that's just been helpful to be able to speak that language and know the game very intimately.
So anyone that knows you on the research side will probably know you for your interest in eccentric training, which is going to be the crux of the conversation today. But where did that interest come from?
It was actually an itch that Dr. Stone wanted to scratch for a number of years. And so I wasn't necessarily interested in it before kind of venturing into what I was going to do for my dissertation. And Dr. Stone had some unpublished data, as did Dr. DeWeese, and got to looking at that and then poured into the existing literature, decided to put all that together and write a review paper, and through that I really kind of started to have my interest sparked and constructed a study with the help of my entire committee, which was Dr. Stone, Dr. DeWeese, Dr. Sato, and then an outside committee member, Chris Tabor. And so kind of through all that, I got the opportunity to construct a study that really took a deep dive into some areas that hadn't yet been explored with the AEL. And so I was kind of the way in which Dr. Stone was able to answer some critical questions that he had, but I was happy and honored to do that.
Nice. So let's dive straight in. You mentioned AEL. I won't leave it 45 minutes to ask you what that actually stands for, like I did on the mastermind, which I should have done a lot sooner. But firstly, benefits of eccentric training. And I know that's a big question, and I'm probably guilty of doing it again, like I did on the mastermind, and bunching eccentric training all together. When, as Mike Young said on that mastermind, that this is a spectrum, so it is a big area. So apologies for chucking this at you. But benefits of eccentric training for the listeners out there.
Yeah, so and we'll get to the kind of the differentiation later. I assume on tempo versus flywheel versus AEL and plyos and whatever else you want to put into that bucket. But really the benefits of eccentric training, to me, it really just comes down to that the force producing isn't constrained by lengthening velocity. That's a really critical piece there, because we can produce really high forces at really high speeds, which happens to occur quite often in sport. And so logically then, even if we kind of bring the neuromuscular side into it, we're able to produce a lot more force per motor unit recruited. All of that kind of just pairs pretty well with how we need to adequately prepare athletes for the demands of sport. And I think a lot of the benefits to eccentric training, we want to kind of zoom in on those mechanistic things, but a lot of the tangible benefits of this training or programming decision really are with longer term application. So that's where we see some really interesting things happen in terms of fast fiber cross-sectional area changes, more explosive performance. We have longer fascicles and more sarcomeres in series, stronger anabolic signals, stiffer muscle tendon units, all kinds of benefits to a variety of athletic endeavors. And so when we start to look at the longer term application of eccentric training and how we can mix that into program design, that's to me where the benefits really start to show themselves.
Do you think it's because of the work of yourself and others that has brought about a bit of a resurgence in the interest in eccentric training as of recently?
I think that there
seems to have been.
I do think it's been gaining popularity for a number of years, and I think the really commercialization of flywheel has been a big part of that. And there's a ton of researchers that have done brilliant work in this space. That Dr. Hoff, Jamie Douglas, Melissa Harden. I'm gonna miss a lot of names, but there were a ton of people that just kind of happened to enter this space all at the same time. And so I do think that having some new information available has definitely generated some interest in the S&C community.
So you've mentioned a couple of things there around fiber type and whatnot, but direct links to athletic dynamic performance. What kind of benefits are we going to gain from, again, bucketing all this stuff into the eccentric training area? What kind of benefits are we going to get?
Yeah, so on the shortening velocity side, that's where the sarcomeres and series come into play. But on the injury risk side, we're getting longer fascicles as well, which even something as simple as the Nordic leg curl very well support, especially when you do add eccentric overload to the Nordic leg curl. It really seems to have an influence on muscle architecture. There does seem to be a preferential hypertrophy to fast fibers, which can help us in a couple of ways. Like obviously, we're going to have bigger, more forceful fast twitch fibers as a result there, but there's also a potential that or a theoretical situation there where we have less drag from the slow twitch fibers just because those fast twitch ones are now making up a larger relative proportion of the whole muscle cross-sectional area. And then as mentioned before, like you do have a stiffer muscle tendon unit, which is going to lend itself very well to dynamic performance improvements too. So that kind of collection of things, tends to be what I would point to the most for linking to dynamic performance. But as I mentioned earlier too, as you continue to zoom out on this, there's stronger anabolic signaling with eccentric training. You have more satellite cell activation. That in theory is going to get you some more muscle size changes, though as I mentioned, that's more at the fiber specific level rather than whole muscle. And then you've got more voluntary agonist activation, downregulation of any kind of inhibitory response from the nervous system. You've got all kinds of things going on that are going to be important for athletes, and that's not to paint it with a broad brush either and say like, oh well, because of that list, I should only focus on eccentric training. It is a piece of the puzzle there, but I do think an underappreciated programming variable, especially with its versatility.
So tell me this, why, based on all those benefits, why would, not to say people are, but why would people not take this on board and implement some of it into their training program? What are the downsides? It seems like there's lots of upsides.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is certainly on the athlete safety side. We see super maximal eccentric loading, and that gets bucketed, as you mentioned before, that kind of all gets bucketed into eccentric training, although eccentric training does not necessarily have to be super maximal. But I do think there's still a little bit of a stigma that this is a very stressful stimulus, and it is. Like even in the submaximal versions of it, like there's certainly some physiological stress associated with this that doesn't necessarily appear with other training methods. But I think there is a way to program it in. But I do think when people, especially, are dealing with team sports, and there's 1,000 different factors and all that complexity there, that there's just some apprehension to fit this in just because of the potential implications for recovery status.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's a big one. The recovery status is the key, sure. Especially with the Nordic. Obviously, we've been through that debate a million times, as sure as everyone else has as well. But even so, not looking at the Nordic, that's a big a big flag for
anyone.
anyone.
And people point very readily to the repeated bout effect, and that's certainly something that we need to consider. But with the progression, the variation, those other aspects that we're considering there, like you're still going to be disruptive to the recovery status of the athlete if you are progressing and providing adequate variation, regardless of what you're doing with the eccentric training side. And so it never goes away. The repeated bout effect doesn't absolve us from considering the stress induced from eccentric training.
So you mentioned that the progression. I think that'd be a really nice place to go next. This little part of the conversation. So for anyone listening who hasn't introduced eccentric focused training before, where would you start? And what's the logical? I know this is again super wide brushstroke with getting everything in there, but what would you recommend for people to progress from start to end? Not there is an end, but end.
The kind of level zero for me would be the tempo or movement cadence manipulation with eccentric training. There's actually not a ton of support for it, especially when it comes to like strength power adaptations, which is pretty logical. If I slow the eccentric phase down, I'm not gonna be able to use as much weight, and that intensity downshift really has implications for strength power changes. And there's certainly been some studies that have demonstrated muscle size changes, but my interpretation of literature, and certainly others have different interpretations, but I have yet to be convinced that slowing down the eccentric phase, for example, is superior than just regular old resistance training without a targeted approach to movement cadence. But that being said, I do think that there's a lot to be gained. And this is really regardless of who you're working with. I think there's a time and a place each year within an annual plan to revisit technique and to make sure that those things are really, really sound and that they are exactly how you want them as a coach. And that's both for athlete safety, but to make sure you're stressing tissues in the way that you intend. And that's really where technique's important for me outside of the athlete safety piece. So I think that's kind of your level zero, but I like flywheel as the next logical progression there. There's a little bit of a elongation, I'll call it, between the eccentric and concentric phase when you have to overcome that inertia at the bottom of, let's just say, a squat, that I think can give people time to produce a lot of force, but they're not necessarily ready to produce that force rapidly. And so the flywheel kind of lends itself well next. Plus, there's a little bit more support on the hypertrophy side, and especially for lesser trained athletes, like you'll see some strength, power, speed, change of direction changes as well. That's pretty well supported. And so to me, that's the next logical step. And then you get into things like AEL and some of that versatility. You might progress within that with submaximal to supermaximal and things of that nature. But AEL then, because of the higher eccentric rate of force development, most notably, that lends itself really well to then progress to plyometrics and really top speed sprinting and those things, which to me are kind of the tail end of what you'd want to expose that athlete to in terms of the highest level of eccentric stress. So whether you want to bucket plyometrics into eccentric training is kind of up to your interpretation. But to me, that's kind of the end of the road, and AEL does a good job to set you up for some of those more advanced plyometrics. But all that being said, I think it's important too that it's more about the blend of these methods, that you're not necessarily going to do one in isolation, that there's going to be kind of elements of each, no matter what stage of training that you're in, and that's important. To be able to set you up for success in progression. So that's another important piece to consider.
Just going back right to the start of that continuum with tempo.
Mm-hmm.
So based on what you've said around the evidence, where does the hype come from in that area? Because anyone, not to dumb it down to my level here, but anyone that goes to the gym for the first time or speaks to someone at the gym and wants to get put on some size, that seems to be, I mean, this is the potential bro science, but where does that hype come from? Because it's 100% will make its way into professional sport because it inevitably does, whether players speak to people themselves or read something somewhere. So where's that actually come from?
I think some of it certainly comes from the resistance training status of most athletes, that it's not as far along as maybe some of us would like to admit. And so there's nothing wrong with starting at that level 0 or getting that technique really dialed in, especially some sports lend themselves to a lot of movement restrictions just by nature of playing. In my time in basketball, teaching those guys to squat was a multiple week endeavor. And so tempo training was a really good tool for me with that population. And so I do think that that's some of it. I also think that there's, and this is maybe not a very popular opinion, and it's not being critical of anyone in particular, but I do think there's an element of managing the perception of a good strength conditioning session, that if you slow things down and everything looks really clean, and an administrator or a front office member or a head coach or whoever were to walk by, even if you do not have any domain specific knowledge of strength conditioning, you would walk by and say, wow, like that is a really clean looking session. And so it lends itself really well for those internal perceptions, but obviously it lends itself very well for external perception as well, if that were to exist on social media or anything like that, that paints the session in a very positive light. And I have not opposed to that at all. I just would also advocate for it being supported from a training stimulus side, and not just primarily emphasized on those things.
Of course, I understand. Very diplomatic. Well done.
Yeah, I needed to be there.
You did. You did well. Did very well. So on the flywheel side, diving into that, that's obviously a continuum within itself, within this bigger eccentric training continuum.
Yeah. So
how can people develop their use of flywheel to then progress onto AEL, and we'll jump onto that in a second. But within that flywheel part, how can people develop that individually?
Yeah, the most important thing, I think, in terms of progressing to AEL that flywheel does is, and I mentioned this prior, but having a longer transition between the eccentric and concentric phase. This is important. Especially if you do have a rehab situation or something like that. But I think it's even important if you have a healthy athlete to give them more time to produce force. And there's also an element here where the athlete can control the intensity. A lot of the eccentric overload present in flywheel training is mediated by the concentric velocity. And so though there is an element of progressive overload in absolute terms with the size of the wheel, a big chunk of that is mediated by the athlete. And so you've got a little bit more versatility there to meet athletes where they're at, and progress them accordingly. And so that kind of not only lets you manipulate the exercise itself, but also the loading without making a bunch of changes to the wheel or anything like that, which I think all of those point to being a prerequisite for AEL. But there's a little bit more versatility there than you'd think too.
So for anyone that doesn't have the budget or the option to tap into flywheel technology, is there anything that would go in its place if that's not the case, or would you have to prolong the tempo side to get to your AEL, which we'll get to in a second?
Yeah, I think in that situation, I would probably just recommend being a little bit more creative in program design for AEL itself, which that's easy for me to say because I have spent a lot of time programming AEL and learning in that space. So I'm certainly biased in that regard. But I do think that AEL gets quickly pointed to the supramaximal version of it, and there is a lot of support for possibly even more support for submaximal variations there. And so I think if you do not have the flywheel, there's ways that you can implement weight releasers or manual eccentric resistance or eccentric overload to provide you a bridge to some of the more aggressive AEL tactics. But you'd certainly need to open up the playbook a little bit there.
So, AEL. Firstly, what does it stand for?
Yep.
Because I've let it go however many 20 minutes, and we've mentioned it a few times, so my bad there. But what does it stand for? And give us a bit of a definition, and then we'll dive into it a bit more.
So accentuated eccentric loading is what AEL stands for. And going back to kind of how I was progressing in my dissertation, as I dove into a lot of that literature, there wasn't a very clear definition, which created a ton of confusion. You will, if you went on Google Scholar and searched AEL, you would have just as many flywheel papers come up as you would anything. And so that created a lot of confusion because the same term was being used for, in my opinion, and really not just my opinion, what effects you would observe from these different types of eccentric loading. They're very unique and distinctly different. And so I thought, along with others that were involved, that we needed to provide a definition to be able to distinguish this from tempo and from flywheel and these other methods. But our first criteria was just that the eccentric load was in excess of the concentric load. So again, doesn't need to be super maximal, but does need to be more than what you're loading on the concentric side, which automatically makes it different from tempo training, where you have the same load on the barbell the whole time, and flywheel, where you have the same inertial load on the way down and on the way up. Excuse me. We also needed a coupled eccentric and concentric action. Sorry, taking a quick drink of water, which made it distinct from negatives. So the eccentric only training, we needed to differentiate from that as well. So we have greater eccentric load than concentric load, coupled eccentric and concentric action. Then the third piece, which is more on the practical side, we needed minimal interruption to the natural mechanics of the selected exercise, which I would argue further differentiates it from flywheel, just because a lot of times you're wearing a harness, and if anyone's ever been on the flywheel device, it's a great training tool, so this isn't a criticism, but if you squat on a flywheel, it's different than when you're squatting with a barbell in terms of the mechanics. And so there is some fundamental changes there, which again is going to stress tissue differently. And so those three pieces were how we kind of separated AEL from the other eccentric training methods.
Just writing them down. So in this phase, so to get all them three, to hit all them three boxes, what strategies can we put in place as coaches to be able to create that scenario in various different exercises?
Yep. So you do have manual resistance. Actually, the first AEL paper was in the 70s, and a gym coach was pushing down on people while they were raising themselves up, or lowering themselves down, in a push-up, and then letting the hand go. And so that was actually the first one. But so manual resistance, there's weight releasers, which are kind of sold all over the place now by a couple different folks. Thirdly, there are some special devices too. There's one, I think it's called the Max Out, but there's some specialty devices. And then lastly, especially when you're applying to plyometrics, you can hold dumbbells, or you can hold onto a band or something like that to create some tension and some resistance in the eccentric phase. But there are some simpler applications there, and the plyometric side is actually a place where I personally am a big advocate of programming AEL. So
I know we've gone through the benefits of eccentric training globally at the start. So specific benefits of those which are inherent with AEL, is there anything that you could dive into for us?
Yeah, outside of what we've covered, which all of basically what I've covered has been supported in the AEL literature as well. Another piece that I don't believe I mentioned earlier on kind of the anabolic side, there does tend to be an acute testosterone and growth hormone response that persists a little bit longer than with traditional loading. And also, and this one's to me one of the more interesting pieces, but there's possibly some alterations in like glycolytic enzyme production and lactate clearance ability with AEL, which could have some advantages for even sports that have a large endurance component. I think of the Soccers of the world, or a 400-meter runner, or something like that, where this was typically AEL was typically kind of reserved for these strength power athlete types, and that may not be the case. Now the glycolytic enzyme side and the lactate clearance side, it's pretty thinly supported. I think only a couple of papers, but intriguing enough to where I think that there's something there to continue to explore.
From your experience on the manual resistance, because that's the one that's most the biggest option for people, given there's no barrier to entry in terms of cost, is there any specific exercises that work well with that? I know you've mentioned push-ups there as a super simple example, or probably more importantly, any that aren't from your experience?
The R, I mean, pull-ups can lend themselves well. I mean, that's basically what you do with negatives. I know that's not AEL, but that's pull-ups lend themselves well. Really, any bodyweight exercise, inverted row, you could figure out ways to manually resist that. I think the ones that don't are probably the lower body minus something like a Nordic leg curl, and that's really just because you got to be really strong as a coach to be able to provide enough resistance to really even change what's occurring with some of those lower bodyweight exercises. But I think the Nordic leg curl would be another where you probably actually provide more manual assistance and progress the eccentric stress rather than pushing someone down in the eccentric phase. Though if you did have someone very strong, that would be an option. But I think especially with the Nordic, a lot of times it gets criticized because of the free fall, and you can progress the eccentric overload by actually providing them a little bit of assistance so they can get to those longer lever lengths.
Yeah, I think I saw, who was it? Houston basketball.
Yeah, with
was it Alan? Yeah, I don't know what device it was. I don't know. Somebody's obviously been clever in creating that, but I haven't seen that before.
I hadn't either. I actually saw that this morning
specific
as well.
device. Yeah. So that was giving assistance through a cantilevered weight position, so they could get to them deep positions. Okay, nice, like it. We're watching the same people spy on the same
really
people.
Good. Alan's really sharp.
Yeah. So, like you mentioned, AEL seems to have a tag that it is for high-end athletes. But is that the case? Can lower-end athletes benefit from some of the methods that the manual, the weight releases, etc., that we just mentioned?
Yeah, I do. Again, the technique piece is going to be where the novice or less trained athletes really get kind of tripped up. I think in terms of loading and the stimulus you're providing, there's not really a barrier of entry there, besides that, obviously you have to consider that eccentric training is pretty stressful. And so they are probably going to take a little bit longer to get through the recovery process from that training. So that's a consideration, but and I think too, if you're looking to apply AEL for potentiation, you've got a much narrower window to operate with to actually induce that potentiation. Just because with AEL or really any protocol that you're looking to induce potentiation, you're walking a tightrope between fatigue and potentiation. And those weaker athletes or less trained athletes, that tightrope's just going to be much thinner. and so those that are stronger probably or maybe even theoretically have a little bit more margin for error on program selection. And so that's another consideration. That you need to go back to the why you're implementing AEL or really any eccentric training method, and if that why is potentiation, the weaker, less trained, I think, have a little bit more reason to not go that route.
Let's have a little dive into that post-activation potentiation side. Any recommendations for people who are looking into this area to tick that box? Timings, potential exercise selection,
Yeah, this was actually what I was more interested in. So my dissertation was more on the acute potentiation side and kind of what's happening there. I thought for sure with kind of the mechanistic underpinnings there that there would be a potentiating effect with AEL. So which some of those mechanistic underpinnings, you got the muscle just in a greater active state, more calcium sensitivity. Yeah, you've got some things that are going on there that lend themselves very well that you'd think like, oh, this is going to induce some potentiation. But it's actually a really mixed bag, especially when it's narrowed to resistance training exercises. So a squat using weight releasers or bench press using weight releasers. There's just as much that it's detrimental to that acute performance as it is beneficial. And there appears to be just a pretty big sensitivity in program design and load structure to where if you were going to apply it to resistance training movements, I think it would be best to do that alongside some sort of augmented feedback, like a velocity measurement or a between set counter movement jump or something like that, just to make sure you're not burying the athlete or not having the effect that you desire there. But on the plyometric side, it's still a little bit of a mixed bag, but you have a little bit more clarity in terms of what is probably going to work and what is probably not going to work. And the studies that do have a favorable acute effect from AEL tend to be ones that have conservative loading. So, holding like a 10 kilo pair of dumbbells during a counter movement jump or a depth jump or whatever the case may be. And then also plyos that have a lesser center of mass displacement during the eccentric phase. So those that have a really large displacement and people are going into like a full squat, AEL doesn't tend to work very well. And it's really just probably the work being done due to that added displacement is causing a fatigue effect. But the tight coupling, the rapid eccentric action with an eccentric overload does appear to be where you can induce some potentiation. So that's where within session, I'm a big fan of holding dumbbells during plyometrics and letting them go at the bottom of the descent and doing some different things there, because I feel a little bit better about the state of the literature and the clarity that's provided there with plyos versus resistance training applications with potentiation. Now, if we're looking at the longer term, then the resistance training is a little bit more well supported there. But for short-term stuff, the plyos, that's kind of where I'm at with it.
So with the plyos, sticking there for a second, with the longer term goal in mind, is there any place in the season or place in the week that you would recommend that goes, or particularly with certain type of player that you would recommend that be used?
I think it's typically my microcycle structure. There's a little bit more stressful contents at the beginning of the week and less stressful contents at the end, just because if we're going to progress in intensity or load or whatever, microcycle to microcycle, providing that recovery at the back end is really important to put them in a position to do so. AEL to me fits better at the front end of a microcycle, and particularly in season, which is, I believe, the specific time period of what you add. I think for players that have a high-speed running demand, or especially upright top speed type mechanics running, having an AEL plyometric early in the week to expose them to some higher eccentric rate of force developments, but not necessarily what they're going to encounter sprinting, and then have a top speed exposure late in the week, which, for us, we play every day in baseball. And so obviously they're going to encounter top speed sometime in between there, but when it's an emphasis within their training, is kind of how I would look at that. But you could be a little bit cleaner in application with sports like soccer or those that don't play every single day. But generally speaking, I think that AEL does a good job, especially when programmed with plyos, in staging some of the sprinting that you're going to need to encounter later in the week.
I still find it absolutely wild that these guys, your guys, are doing what the amount of work that they do. And just in terms, like, even if they weren't playing, just getting around all these different places, it's it's not like England where you can get to the other end of the country in 4 or 5 hours. Like, you guys are traveling all over the place.
Incredible.
It's wild.
Probably the biggest adjustment that I've had to make is the scope of the operation being spread out all over the country. Is really the players, hats off to them for being able to go out and perform when they're spread out like that is really remarkable.
Yeah. So you've mentioned the dropping of dumbbells on the eccentric phase to then obviously without them on the concentric phase. Is there any other application of AEL in terms of jumps that people could have a little play with?
Yeah, I like it. Kind of again putting this on a spectrum. If you have the AEL counter movement jump as step one, and then you progressed, kind of using the higher eccentric rate of force development that you got from that AEL counter movement jump to set you up for success with a depth jump or shock method, kind of whatever you want to call it. But then you can actually progress from that by bringing AEL back and holding it while you step off the box, let it go when you hit the ground, and proceed as you would with the normal shock method type of plyometric training. And so that's where I think you can add a wrinkle that maybe wasn't as popularly programmed as was in the past. Because I think that then sets you up for things, repeat serial jumps like hurdles, things that are very aggressive, in my opinion. And so that's kind of where I see that fitting on a spectrum of plyometrics. But the application doesn't necessarily need to be any different. I think dumbbells are pretty versatile across that whole thing.
But obviously, with them progressions, people need to be careful because they'll get buried and get buried pretty quickly without identifying the right athlete and the right stage of development.
Yeah, and I think too. One thing that did come from my dissertation, which this isn't applied to plyos, we actually saw this using the back squat and weight releasers. But in terms of stress management and even session management, there's potentially the opportunity for the athlete to hold on to those high eccentric rates of force development for subsequent repetitions, even after the eccentric overload is gone. So what we observed was overloading only the first repetition. Our subjects held on to those high eccentric rates of force development for reps 2 and reps 3, even when the weight releasers weren't on the bar anymore.
Interesting.
So if you then were pretty liberal in your application to plyometrics, you could, if you're doing 3-4 repetitions, like, you don't necessarily need to overload every single one, because there are some practical barriers too. Like, you got to go pick the dumbbells up, or you got to put the weight releasers back on. But practical barriers aside, there's also a load management component there that you can kind of distribute that a little bit more easily than we thought in the past.
Just logistically, we mentioned baseball and how crazy it can get the majority of the time. Implementation of this when guys are on the road, is that something that you do, or you're keeping it for when people are a bit more on site? How do you manage that logistically?
Yeah, I can't say that there's a ton that's done in season on the weight releaser side. We do use the flywheel with some players, and we obviously program a lot on the plyometric side. But during the off season, we will use it to solve a particular performance problem, and not necessarily that any athlete couldn't benefit from being more explosive or powerful or anything like that. But we do face, baseball is a very skill dominant sport. There's a lot of people that are, maybe their physical profile isn't overly impressive, but they are among the world's best in their sport because they are so skilled. But there are also times where the skill is there, but the physical is limiting their ability to express that skill. And so in the off season, sometimes we will have players that, hey, this person's explosiveness is limiting their ability to do what they need to do at the plate or on the mound or whatever the case may be. And so that's where AEL will get a little bit more run, and we'll use it in almost a full block or even multiple blocks of training in the off season, because we're not as worried about the fatigue management side either. And they don't have as much going on. There's not as many factors to consider, but with all of the explosive performance, with the muscle phenotype changes, the neuromuscular adaptations, all those things that we've already covered at length here, with all of those in place, if the person's explosiveness is limiting their ability to do their job, or limiting their ability to do their job to the level that they need to, that's where we will very judiciously program ADL because of what we think we're going to see from an adaptation standpoint. And that's particularly the case if a player is multiple years into our system, that he's now an advanced training status athlete. And just like with any advanced training status athlete, you have to provide them even more overload, even more variation, even more novelty in order to drive a new adaptation. And so AEL lends itself really well in the off season when we do have those specific cases, and we've done that on multiple occasions here.
I was speaking to Damien Harper, and anyone that knows of Damien's work in deceleration, this links very well with my conversation with him, because he talked a lot about eccentric loading and AEL. So that's a nice link with the deceleration component of the dynamic performance that we spoke about right at the start.
Yeah, Damien's brilliant. He's doing a lot of really good work, and he's another one that I didn't mention earlier that is critical in popularizing eccentric training too, because he's now linked it to an athletic action that is, in pretty much every sport, and so that's made it. He's done a lot of really good work on the research side, but also on the applied side, so it's been impressive to follow.
So, just off topic slightly, John, I'm really interested to hear where you fit in the organization. So, as Director of Performance Science and Player Development, where do you sit? What's your roles and responsibility? I know there's probably a question for the start, but I'm just interested based on our chat.
Yeah, so I basically exist to support other people and to collaborate effectively. On the player development side, we have director of hitting and pitching performance that are kind of our technical tactical coaches with our position players and pitchers. So I work really, really closely with them and their staffs, but we also have domain experts in a lot of different areas: behavioral science, leadership development, nutrition, strength conditioning, all of those areas. I work very closely with and do oversee the strength conditioning side, but physical therapy, medical, all of those pieces kind of come together in the development of our players. And then someone that I work very, very closely with, Austin Driggers, who's brilliant. He provides the performance science support at the major league level, so he's based in Kansas City. So that we need to have an effective bridge to what's happening at the major league level. But on the PD side, on the player development side, we're tasked with developing championship caliber players and getting them to the major leagues. And so that's not done by any single person. It's done by that village and collection of people, and all of our success is very intimately tied together. And so that's really where my role sits, is to help answer those performance questions, to ask really good questions too, and then just help people be more effective in what they're trying to do.
Talking about asking good questions, I hope I've got what people wanted out for me to get out of you in terms of eccentric training. But one thing that I think I have missed is where this fits into the bigger program, into the traditional lift, the traditional training methods, and to precaution people not to, and this is putting words in your mouth now, to not, this isn't the program, this is part of a program. So it's just getting your opinion on where it really sits. Yeah.
And I will give a more concrete answer, but of course I have to start with it depends on what adaptation you're trying to induce. And so we've talked about a spectrum of things, whether that be maybe favorable for the conditioning side on up to the neuromuscular system, or at the muscle phenotype level. There's a lot of different ways to go about this. So first and foremost, you have to be adaptation-led in your decisions and where you're going to put things into a program or into an annual plan. But with AEL specifically, I do think it fits very neatly. At the tail end, when you do have a demand to either develop a little bit of max strength or retain the max strength that you've already developed, but stage some of those higher power output, higher velocity efforts maybe you have more top speed sprinting, or you're trying to jump your highest, run your fastest, be at your best. Kind of staging a taper would kind of be where I would put that, not only for what it can retain, but what it can expose the athlete to in terms of high eccentric rates of force development. And if you are going to follow AEL with a taper, you're okay with the intentional high stress nature of that eccentric training. And so if you're going to pull training contents away to promote that recovery, AEL fits really, really well as part of an overreach to stage a taper, or the block prior to set that stuff up. And so that's, if I were going to program it exactly where I wanted, that's kind of where I'd put that.
Superb. Well, 45 minutes is absolutely flown, and I've got a bunch of notes that I'm sure everyone else has who's listening to this as well. But what's next for you in this area in terms of research, and where can people find the work that you've already done?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate. I work in the applied setting now, so I'm outside the traditional lab, but I have a lot of people that are willing to collaborate. So I've partnered with some people at Sacred Heart. With Dr. Chris Tabor and the folks that he's working with there. We've produced some more AEL research, particularly with the bench press, still using the weight releasers. And then I partner with some people at West Virginia. That's more on the counter movement jump side of things rather than AEL. But I'm just really, really fortunate to have made some good connections that can keep me in the research world. But that's not necessarily my primary thing at this point. But if you want to see any of that work or hear any of my random thoughts on sports science or training, I'm probably most accessible on Twitter. I don't even have an Instagram or anything like that, or Facebook, but I get on Twitter quite a bit. So happy to engage with anybody there.
And what's the all-important Twitter handle, John?
At Dr. John P. Wagle.
Nice. Well remembered. But no, thank you very much for giving up 45 minutes of your time. And the dog, anyone that's watching on video, the dog has done absolutely superb in the background, kept nice and quiet, super chilled. So yeah, thank you very much, and look forward to chatting to you soon.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Rob.
Cheers, John.